click on that right now. It's going to launch my software. I'm sorry it's not on. So a couple of things that, as this is getting started, there's a couple of things I want to mention. I think I might have mentioned this last time, but it's a reminder. Save often, so Command S is the hotkey for save. Every day that you work on a file, what are you supposed to do? Resave the file, and I'm going to give it a different number. Okay, so that way I have a progression. Why do I do that? Why would I want to save out a different version every day that I work on it? Yes, William? In case of corruption. That way I only lose a day, not 2 weeks worth of work, which, by the way, happens all the time. Thomas, what's up?
I was just going to say because the program is volatile.
And the program is absolutely volatile. What I mean by volatile, it's describing that it has a tendency to just crash. So, Angela, you worked with me before. Did it ever crash on you randomly?
Yes.
Yes. So Angela is speaking from experience. It crashes randomly. So you have to be sort of prepared for that. And there's a part of this where you just have to be at peace with it as well, because it's just going to happen. All right? But we're going to try to learn best practices so we avoid hurting ourselves in the long run by not saving correctly. Okay, so this is the how to make a file window, and I didn't go over this very thoroughly last time. I sort of just said, let's make a file really quickly and launch it. This time I want to go over it a little bit with a little bit more detail. Now, you'll notice that when I launch the window, it basically is showing me the recent files or sizes or dimensions. So you can see that it has kind of a big mess of stuff on here. But you'll notice to the right of this little divider, we can see that there are different mediums that the software is preparing to work in. Okay, so you'll notice that I have 5 different mediums: mobile, web, print, film, video, and art illustration. So when you click on these different mediums, you'll notice that it gives you dimensions specific to the sizes under that umbrella. Does that make sense? So if I'm looking at mobile, it's going to give me mobile dimensions for particular devices. So one of the things that you should keep in mind, that if you're using CS6, I know I get students every once in a while that say, can I use CS6? CS6 is seven years old now. So it doesn't have a lot of the features in terms of these updated dimensions that the current version has. So every time you do an update, they update these dimensions for the most common devices that are available to users. Okay, so I'm just letting you know that this list is constantly changing. Right, so here are mobile devices, and mobile, because it's a screen graphic, you'll notice that it describes it in pixels. Okay, so there's different unit of measurements depending on the medium that you're working in. So if it's for screen, which is a mobile device, where you're looking at a little screen, it's going to describe it in pixels. The same thing would be true for web. If I'm looking at web dimensions, it's a screen, it's describing it in terms of pixels. Does that make sense, everyone? So web aspect ratios, so an aspect ratio is the width and the height. So web aspect ratios tend to be horizontal, like this. Mobile aspect ratios tend to be vertical. But you might hold your phone like this, right? So phone dimensions can also be what are called responsive. Okay, well, websites are also responsive. But the default dimensions for web are going to be horizontal. These are going to be vertical. And then we have print. Print, you can change it to be horizontal or vertical depending on your presentation. And for print, there are different units of measurements that designers will work with. So points might be one of them, but you'll notice that when I go to the settings for the document where it says points, you'll notice that I can click and select different units of measurement. We're going to come back to this in a few seconds here. Film and video, this is also going to be a pixel dimension, but is this going to be horizontal or vertical? What do you think? How do you normally see a movie? Is it like this or tall? It's wide, right? So it's going to be a horizontal presentation. And these dimensions are driven by the pixel density of the device that you're designing for. So a few years ago, this didn't exist, 4K. 8K definitely didn't exist. but HDTV did. Now there are legacy dimensions, and what I mean by legacy dimensions are dimensions that were available to us many, many years ago. So for example, here's one called NTSC D1. Look at the pixel dimensions there. Compare that to 8K. Look at the difference in density. Okay? So it's a huge difference. And we'll talk about pixel density and legacy. What I mean by legacy are the older technologies and how it influences us today. We'll have a conversation about that at some point. And you'll notice that the last dimension that I have here is art and illustration. And they're going to have stuff like postcards and some other random stuff. But for the most part in my classes, I usually teach to print unless we're dealing with a specific topic, such as building a website or building a mobile app or making a movie. So most of my dimensions revolve around print, so this is usually the area that we'll be focusing on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at print dimensions, we have the ability to change the units of measurement. By default, it's set to points. You'll notice that we have millimeters and centimeters. So that would be an appropriate unit of measurement anywhere outside of the US. Does that make sense? So if you were in Europe, you would probably be working in these two dimensions right here. Since we're in the US, we're going to use what I call US standard, and US standard is inches. So that's what I work in when I publish content for my clients. I've been publishing work for close to 20 years now, and if it's mobile or web or online content, we work in pixels. But if I'm producing something for print, I want to say that in the 20 years that I've been working, I've only worked on 2 documents that was not set in inches. So I'm just trying to prove a point that if you're going to be working in the US and publishing content, the dimensions revolve around that unit of measurement. Now there's another unit of measurement called picas. And picas is a 1:6 ratio. You take an inch and you divide it into 6 equal units, and that's how picas describe their dimensions or sizes. It's an old lead, letter, and wood press dimension, so there's a long history of this. And newsprint revolves around picas. Remember I said there's 2 documents that I created that did not use inches? Those 2 documents used picas. Okay, so I've never worked in picas, even though I'm never, except for these 2 occasions, even though I'm constantly producing print work. Okay, so we're going to focus on inches. Okay, so I'm going to go to inches. Now, when we look at our sizes out here, you'll notice that when we look at print dimensions, at the beginning, it doesn't really look like we have a whole lot of options. Now, you'll notice that we have 3 dimensions that have names associated with them. This one says letter, this one says legal, this one says tabloid. Okay, so letter is 8.5 by 11. So when we talk about letter, we're looking at a sheet of paper that looks like this. Okay, now when I am referring to tabloid, it's taking an 8.5 by 11. What did we call this again? Letter. So an 8.5 by 11 is a letter. And I stick 2 of them together, and I get 11 by 17, and that's called tabloid. Does that make sense? So letter, tabloid, letter, tabloid. Letter can be horizontal, it can be vertical. Tabloid could be horizontal, it can be vertical. If it's vertical, it looks like a poster, right? It's a nice, good-sized poster. So what is legal? What is legal? Legal is a document that's 8.5 by 14. So it looks something like this. It's really long. And the reason it's called legal is that it has an area where a potential receipt might be, where a signature would occur, or a tear would happen and you'd hand that over to somebody else. Legal implies what it's used for. Contracts or sales. So legal documents. Does that make sense? So most content is produced in letter or tabloid in the US. Now there's always custom sizes, absolutely, but we're just talking about generalizations for now. Does that make sense? Okay, so one of my goals for you is to learn design vocabulary. So this conversation that we're having about pixels, picas, inches, tabloid, letter, legal, that's design vocabulary. So while it might seem like a simple conversation about a dimension, it's part of our vocabulary, okay? So I'm gonna stick to letter, and I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna look at my settings. Here I change my orientation. So this will leave it in portrait or vertical. This will go to landscape or horizontal. Those are the other terms that are assigned to them. There's an attribute called a bleed. And a bleed is usually set to 1/8 of an inch. So as a decimal, it's 0.125. Okay, now the bleed is a margin on the outside of the document. On the outside of the document. Margins are usually on the inside, right? This is a margin on the outside. Huh? Why would I want a margin on the outside? Well, a bleed is there to remind you that if you have a graphic that goes to the edge, a color bar, a photo, if it goes to the edge, it actually needs to go beyond the edge to that outside margin in the event that the document is cut out of a larger sheet of paper. And if there's an error in the cut, it will trap the image. It won't leave a little sliver of white. Okay, so that's what the bleed does. It captures any images going to the edge. So when you design images to the edge of the document, you're supposed to bleed them out. That's where the term comes from. You want to bleed it beyond the edge. All right, so and the dimension is 1/8 of an inch. You'll notice that there are advanced options. We will talk about these later. Okay, not today. All right, so you'll notice that there's one last variable that I haven't discussed, which is called an artboard. What is the default? One artboard. So I'm going to make this document. I'm going to hit OK. I want you to see it, and then we're going to make a new document right away with 3 artboards on it. Okay, so we're going to do this one first so we can see it. Hit Create. All right, so here's my document. I'm going to zoom out, which is Command minus. Okay, so as you can see here, there's only one workspace. This is called an artboard. I only have one artboard in this document. Okay, that's what we expected to happen. I'm going to close this document. I'm going to make a new one. So this should remember the settings that I just used. So you'll notice it has the bleed in it. It has the 8.5 by 11. But in this case, I'm going to create 3 artboards. 3 artboards. Okay, bless you. So I'm going to hit Create. And you'll see now I have 3 documents available for me, or 3 workspaces for me to work with within my software. I just closed it. Control W was closed, and Control N or File New would bring you back to that screen. You don't have to close it to make a new document.
Sorry, Marco.
Yes.
I can't even get onto my preset settings.
Anybody not able? Everybody able to create? You have a question? I'll do it one more time. Just cancel out of this. You're going to go to File New. Let me do it again, because other people have questions. So I closed it, and then went to File New. Here you go. She needs help right here. Second from the end. Right here. Upwards. Okay, so I clearly went too fast. I'm going to do it one more time slowly, okay? So, first of all, to clarify, I don't need to close this to make a new file. I don't need to close it to make a new file. I can make a new file whenever I want. I can have 10 files open at the same time. Doesn't matter. Okay? So, but I decided to close it. So if I want to make a new document, you go to the File menu. There it says New. What is the hotkey for New? William? Command N. Remember, hotkeys are usually the first letter of the phrase or command and the first letter. Usually. But sometimes there's weird stuff that happens. But you'll notice that File New is Command N. All right, so if I want to make a new document, I'm going to go to File New, and I get that new document window again. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of this. I'm going to close this document to show you how to close it. Right, so look, File, and there it is, Close. So this is kind of weird. What is the hotkey for close? Command W. So if you ever just see my document close, I'm hitting Command W. That's what I'm doing, okay? So what was the hotkey for new document? Command N. Okay, so there it is. There's my new window. And look, over here are my settings, 8.5 by 11. I'm selecting letter. It's under print. Selecting letter under print. All right, and I selected bleed, set to, in inches. I selected bleed at 1/8 of an inch. Okay, and then how many artboards did I make? 3. So this is the artboard field. All right, so 2, 3. And then I hit create. Okay, so that's how I got here. Anybody else need help? Cindy, can you help her out? Are we good? We all at the same place? Okay, great. So look, I just launched my software. What am I supposed to do? I gave you some advice last class. What am I supposed to do? You guys remember? I said whenever you launch software, this is the first thing you should do when you come into the lab. Yes! What is your name? Liberty? Thank you so much, Liberty. That was great. Reset the workspace. We need to reset the workspace. So I'm going to go to the window menu, and I'm going to go to workspace, and I'm going to select Reset Essentials Classic. Reset Essentials Classic. And when I do that, it puts all of the panels back where they belong. All right, so it didn't really change a lot in my session, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to reset the Essentials Classic. I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned that when I work with my session, I like my toolbar to be set in 2 columns. And this is the little arrow, double arrow that I click on to set it into 2 columns. Okay, so one of the things that I was required to describe to you in our agenda conversation is this area right here. This area right here. You'll notice that there's little dividers in the toolbar. This top group, these are called selection tools. Selection tools. Okay, now we have a series of selection tools, but the most important selection tool is this black one. Okay, when you hover over the icons, it tells you what it's called. So, dumb question, Maya. What is this tool called? It's called the selection tool, right? So this one on the left, the black one, is the most important. It's just called the selection tool. Now, Maya, what's the one on the right called? Direct selection tool. Direct selection tool. So I want you to see that they are called something different. And you'll also notice that there's a letter in brackets. Do you see that? A letter in brackets. So the direct select tool, the white one, what's the hotkey for that? What's the one for the regular selection tool? V. Okay, so in this case, it doesn't really make sense. Why V for selection? So the selection tool. And then you have a couple of specialized selection tools below it. So Illustrator also has a series of menus on the top. And on the menus on the top, it sort of has a collection of features that have been logically organized. Do you see a menu that's tied to selection? The select menu. So the select menu has features that allow us to work with these tools or do the same thing. So when they do the same thing, there's a term in software that's called redundancy. So redundancy means that it's available in more than one place, or there's more than one way to do that. All right, so there's some redundancy between the select menu and the selection tools. Okay, so one of the options here is deselect. Deselect. Right? So if I have something selected and then I don't want it selected, there's an option here. That means let go, right? If I'm going to deselect, it lets go of the shape. And you'll also notice that there's an option that says select inverse. Let's say I have a triangle, a circle, and a square, and I select the square, and then I go to select inverse, it'll let go of the square and select the triangle and circle. It'll select the opposite. That's what select inverse is. If you work in Photoshop, you may have used a similar feature to that. And you'll also notice that there are selection features that allow us to select things based on what they look like. So based on the fill color, based on the stroke color, based on how thick they are, based on how they appear, based on the object type. So you can filter your selections based on these two options that you see here. But to be honest with you, 95% of your experience in Illustrator, so the majority of your experience in Illustrator, to select the content, you're going to be using that black arrow. Like over 90%. So that's really the important tool. So one of the things that I also like to do when I teach my courses is I cut through the nonsense. And I put the value in the areas where it will serve you. It is important that I show you some specialized tools, but I'm going to spend most of my time on tools that are important for you. And I'm going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you this tool is important. This tool, like, I never use it. I want you to understand where the value is in the software. Diego, am I pretty good at doing that? Okay, pretty good? I get it wrong every once in a while? So I do my best to give you the right information. So I want to take a break right here because we've been talking for about a half hour. And this is about the time where I go, okay, time to stop. You know, exercise a little bit, get up, move around, take a pause, and then we'll get going. If you have nothing better to do, I want you to find a couple of images to manipulate. Okay, so download a couple images from Google. So we'll get started again in about 5 minutes. Okay?